like engage in a dialogue.
Please tell us which historical event do you remember first that affected your life?
First, I remember when my cat Calico cried.
The first historical event, the first nationally historical event. What kind of question should I ask?
I don't know the function. I don't know the.
It doesn't matter. You're supposed to tell me a story about some history. Would you please tell us about your experiences in the Vietnam War?
Well, I was too young to fight in the Vietnam War, but I remember the anti-war demonstrations. And at that time, I was in elementary school, and I was living in New York City. And I used to have to ride the bus past Columbia University in New York City, and there were lots of hippies and young men and women in the streets carrying signs saying U.S. out of Vietnam and ban the bomb and Nixon is a murderer or Johnson is a murderer. And there was just a lot of turmoil at that time in the 60s. In fact, in Central Park, just about every weekend, there was a big demonstration against the Vietnam War. Another thing that I remember about the Vietnam War is that even though we didn't have a television, I would go to my friend's house and see television. And every night there would be a tally of how many soldiers had died or were injured. And casualty tallies were a daily reminder of the tragedy of war. So I would say that it affected my feelings as a child. It made me feel depressed a lot of the time and nervous a lot of the time. Of course, this all went along with the same feeling that you got when you had to do these civil defense drills, and they would say, all right, students, we're going to have a nuclear simulation of a nuclear war, and everybody get under the table or go into the basement of the school. And that was supposed to protect us from annihilation.
Do you remember your parents feeling any certain way about the war?
Oh, they were both dead set against it. They were both very much against it. They knew that we were intervening in a civil war on the other side of the world, civil war between the North and the South of Vietnam, and that we were repeating the same mistakes as the French a generation earlier, the French who had ultimately decided that the war was futile, and we were just going down the same path as the French did during the Indochina War. And so even though they didn't demonstrate, I got the feeling that we were better off if we could get out of Vietnam, and the sooner the better.
Did your parents ever look down on the hippies or think of them as being stupid or immature?
No. My father was a member of the NAACP, and he demonstrated for other issues, for civil rights. My mother was more reserved, and she would never get involved in anything like a demonstration, but I think that subtly they informed us about the pros and the cons of war in general.
Did they discuss the war, or did your school take any kind of side in the war?
No.
The public schools never?
No. However, this was during the 60s, and the schools were taking a turn toward liberalization of pedagogy. And so there was a more relaxed teaching environment, and there was a lot of experimenting and teaching at the time where students were given a lot more freedom for the first time, and I was fortunate to be in the forefront of that movement. And I remember one day going to school and discovered that the school was closed and we were going to have school in some community building. And I think the teachers were on strike at one point, But we had a lot of freedom, and there was a lot of experimenting of different methods of teaching, and a lot of it was good. We got to sing a lot of songs, and one of my teachers, a music teacher, taught us some anti-war songs. I still remember that one song was um, I guess it was "We Shall Overcome," and maybe that's not an anti-war song, but a civil rights song. But she taught us a lot of anti-establishment types of songs. Another song was called "Little Boxes," and it was all about the uniformity of society, which was prevalent in the 50s, and how ridiculous that was.
Do you feel that you experienced anything that others wouldn't if they hadn't, because they didn't live in New York City?
Yeah, in New York City, because there's a greater population, I think that there was more energy, and there was generally a lot of excitement. If you saw TV, or if you walked down the street toward downtown, at least once a week there was some big demonstration. A lot of times there was tear gas being lobbed, and you would smell the tear gas. The police would use tear gas to clear the streets. And overlapping this, unfortunately, Martin Luther King died, and there was a lot of demonstrations at that point. I remember seeing on TV a lot of buildings burning not far from where we lived, and there was a lot of destruction and a revolutionary fever in the air. People who were oppressed were feeling like their backs were against the wall, and so normal human psychology is to fight back, and there was a lot of destruction and death during that time. Pretty much back to back, Martin Luther King was killed, and Malcolm X was killed. Robert Kennedy was killed. And then I went to summer camp, and they told us that we could no longer fire rifles at summer camp, so I couldn't get my marksman patch in the NRA. And so at that time I really liked shooting rifles, and I was disappointed because they took away all of our rifles. And so there was a lot of reaction to that. And like I said, every time you turned on the TV or read the paper, you were submerged in the tragedies of that day or that period by reading about attacks and fights and battles where American lives were killed. And a lot of times they didn't even report on how many Viet Cong were killed or Vietnamese were killed, but you knew that hundreds more were killed for every American. So it was just a general feeling of oppression. And then as I got a little bit older in high school, I realized that even though we had never been a victim of nuclear attack, there were thousands of missiles aimed at our country, and we had thousands of missiles aimed at China and Soviet Union. And so you felt like there was this big looming threat over your head. And so it was just a general feeling of fear, big sense of fear and dread.
Were you afraid of the Soviet Union or of Sputnik? Or
Early on, yeah, because the American mode was to paint the communists as the worst enemy, the most feared enemy, the most terrible enemy, and not to portray the people of the Soviet Union or Red China as people, but rather a monster or some ferocious animal about to attack you. And it wasn't until I got to college and I started reading books about Russians and books about Chinese and books about Cubans that I realized that the same feelings that we had toward them, they had toward us. And that a lot of it was hysteria generated by fear, and a lot of it was generated by the military-industrial complex, So I started really going the opposite direction and trying to discover the real people behind the wall, behind the red curtain and the iron curtain, and read magazines and looked at pictures of people behind the Iron Curtain and watched movies, watched early Soviet movies, and incredibly beautiful, emotional movies were available, and it just really opened my eyes.
When did you move to Miami, Florida?
When I was about 12.
What year was that?
72. No, wait a minute. It was 1970. I guess it was 1970 or 71. Yeah, I guess it was 1970 that we moved to Miami.
Did you experience similar feelings towards the Soviets and the Chinese and other overseas relationships down in Miami compared to in New York City?
Well, Miami at that time was very much more protected from the front lines of the news, and it was more of a smaller community feeling and more of a sleepy town. And it wasn't until really the early 80s that Miami began to awake and become more of an international city. So yeah, I all of a sudden I went from being in the front line, so to speak, to being isolated. And then in 1972, there were two major conventions in Miami Beach, and that was sort of like my opening again to being aware of what's going on in the world, because all of the media descended upon Miami Beach, and all of the same people who were in the big cities like New York City came down to Miami Beach to demonstrate. And they had first they had the Democratic conventions in Miami Beach, and then they had the Republican conventions in Miami Beach. And I was just beginning to take photographs, and so I convinced my mother to let me take a bus down to Miami Beach alone, and I spent every day for a week exploring the whole scene where the hippies would confront the conventioneers. And there was tear gas, and there was fighting, and people were dying, and the demonstrators were standing in front of Cadillac cars full of delegates to these conventions, and the drivers were speeding ahead and running over the demonstrators. And I photographed all of that. And I went to Flamingo Park in Miami Beach, and I hung around the hippies and the zippies and all of the anti-war people. Norman Mailer was there, a famous writer. A lot of famous people were there, and I talked to a lot of people and really opened my eyes. I saw a lot of things that I wouldn't have normally seen, and I did a photographic essay on the scenes there. And then a couple weeks later, they had the next convention, the Republican convention, and there was just as much havoc and uproar. And at this time, Nixon was president. He was about to be swept into office in the most overwhelming victory to that date, and he won by a huge landslide. But of course, at that time, Nixon, in his previous term in office, he had kept America in the Vietnam War in spite of his promises to get us out. He was elected in I guess it was in '68, he was elected to office stating that he was going to get us out of Vietnam. And yet, not only did he keep us in Vietnam, but he involved us in a covert war in Cambodia. And all of this behind the backs of Congress and doing clearly illegal things. Finally, a couple of years after he was swept into office in a landslide, he was impeached, and he had to leave office. But at that time, during the convention, everybody was against Nixon, and I remember seeing signs and spray painting on the walls that said "Mad Bomber."
So during this time, did you feel as though you couldn't trust your government?
Well, I don't want to profess that I really knew the ins and outs and who was doing what. My eyes were just opening as to who the main players were. I didn't really understand what was going on at the time. I mean, I was just 15 years old, I guess. I didn't I don't remember taking sides, but I remember feeling a lot of empathy toward the demonstrators. And yet there I was standing behind the police lines, being protected by them as the tear gas canisters were being lobbed at the demonstrators. I myself never received any tear gas directly because I was behind the police lines. But I photographed a lot of demonstrators being hit with clubs and billy clubs and seeing blood streaming down their face and coming from their head and blood-soaked hair. I saw young men and women, college age, just a few years older than me, probably scarred for life by these activities, and I really felt like they were taking a stand. They were not just talking, they were walking the walk.
So did you ever want to be a hippie?
Part of me is still a hippie. I believe I'm a hippie. And I would say I'm maybe 40% hippie, but hippie, of course, is a meaningless phrase. At the time, the term hippie was used to both support and to degrade people. So hippie is a relative term. I would say if the Vietnam War were happening today, I would take a stand against it.
In what year did you first visit Latin America?
That was in 1974.
Were there any government conflicts at the time taking place, and where in the regions that you stayed?
Well, at that time, the American government supported Latin American dictatorships because the dictators were sending commodities to the United States, and clearly it was in the United States' favor to support these dictators and the business that it brought. America was able to exploit these poor countries, and the way they exploited them was by forcing these countries to support very few commodity production, very small, very tight amount of commodities productions. And so we were getting products from them like bananas or pineapples or whatever from them very cheap, and they in turn, since they didn't have any other farms or any agriculture, they had to buy products that they would normally be able to produce themselves. They had to buy them from us, so they were losing in both cases and we were winning. The dictators were supported by the United States in various ways through military support and financial support and under-the-table support. My first year I went to Nicaragua, where the president was Somoza, typical dictator, and his father was the dictator 50 years before that. The long heritage of dictatorship, and the poor people, the campesinos, were the ones who suffered. 5% of the people were super, super rich, and 95% were super, super poor. So it really was shocking to me to see the poverty, and I didn't really understand the political, economic dynamics at the time. But I remember being very troubled by it. And it wasn't until I went to college and started reading about what's going on behind the scenes and how the United States was doing a lot of nefarious things, like supporting the overthrow of democratically elected leaders, such as in Chile, so that the dictators could continue sending cheap commodities to us. I didn't learn about that until I was in college. But when I went to Nicaragua the first summer, I was in high school, and I worked in the front lines, helped the poor people and gave their babies vaccinations and things like that. I did that again in Nicaragua the second summer of '75, and then in '76 I was part of the staff of this volunteer group, and I was assigned to Honduras.
Can you tell us about your encounter with the Sandinistas, was it?
Right. In my second year of being in Nicaragua, I was assigned to a very small village out in the boonies in the campo in El Campo, which means the country. And after being there 2 weeks, me and my work partner, we got really bored, and so we decided we were going to take off for the closest town and go shoot some pool. And we didn't have our passports because the program took our passports and collected them and kept them safe for us. So we were going on the public transportation without any identification, really. And we were shooting some pool in this small town, in this small city, and the samosistas, the Samosa National Guard, came up to us and said, documentos, let's see your documents. And we didn't have anything. So they took me and him and my partner, they paraded us down the street for about 10 blocks, very humiliating, to the city jail. And there we had to sit for half a day. And we didn't have any way, this was before cell phones, and there was really no telephone anyway. We didn't have any way of contacting the program leaders, but we were told that we were thought to be Sandinistas. And at that time, the Sandinistas were beginning to win some victories in some small battles against the dictators. The Sandinistas were the revolutionaries who eventually won in '79 and were able to overthrow Somoza and kill him, actually, ending decades and decades of oppression. And the Sandinistas stayed in power through much of the '80s and effected a lot of change, similar to what Castro did in Cuba. Gave a lot of the poor people land where they had no land, and taught the poor people and improved literacy. And, you know, of course, the American government under Reagan was incensed about this and sent a whole another group of Americans over there, covertly funneled money from selling guns to Iran, of all places, funneled the money that the profits from that into supporting the Contras. And that was a big scandal called the Iran-Contra-Gate that Reagan was bedeviled by. Anyway, at the time when I was down there, I was just beginning to learn what a Sandinista was. And it wasn't really until I got to college that I learned how dangerous it was for me to be there and be accused of that, because I could have very easily been in prison for a long amount of time or be subjected to torture myself. But eventually we were freed later that day, and we were scolded and sent back to our villages.
So when you went back to the States and you started college, were there any big events that changed your typical life during that time?
Well, it seems like when I went to college, again, the tear gas followed me, because I went to a college that was very close to a university called Kent State. I went to college in Ohio. And in 1970, I don't know if you know this, but in Kent State, the National Guard of Ohio was called out to stop a demonstration of anti-war demonstrators. And they were not supposed to have live bullets in their rifles, but they did. And when the demonstrators wouldn't go away fast enough, the National Guard fired upon the demonstrators at Kent State, killing 4 of them and injuring dozens more. And this is called the Kent State Massacre. It's there's actually songs. There's one famous song by, I believe, Neil Young that you can listen to about the Kent State massacres. So anyway, all across Ohio at that time, there were huge demonstrations against the police and against the war. And when I got to college, even though it was 5 years later, there were still demonstrations going on against the police. It was like a ritual. Every springtime at a certain time, or at Halloween, the young people would line the streets of the college towns and throw bricks at the police. And of course, the police didn't know how to handle it. They would get the riot gear on and try and intimidate the young people, and then there was a big confrontation. And then there was tear gas. So the tear gas came out again. I was in college, and this time I was on the newspaper staff photographing that behind the police lines. And this time I really had a problem with the tear gas. And I was gassed a few times. a lot of young people were maimed by the tear gas canisters because even though it was just tear gas, it came out in the form of a pellet. And if it hit your face or eye, you were blinded. So there was a lot of, in fact, one student was killed one spring demonstration. And so I saw a lot of craziness, a lot of havoc in my college years too.
Was there a point at which you saw all of this fade away and kind of like a turning of a page? Was there one distinctive year that just kind of washed away that part of history?
Well, what happened, it seems to me, was that in the end of the 70s, we had the gas crisis, and we also had a national recession. President Carter came in as a very popular president, but he was subjected to a lot of world situations, world events that he had no control over. And one of these was the growth of power by OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And this included all of the Arab countries that sell oil and petroleum to the United States. So they came together, OPEC came together, and they realized that they had a lot of leverage and a lot of strength, and they started raising the cost of oil. And this was shocking to Americans because up until that time you could get gas, a gallon of gas, for 39 cents a gallon. And then all of a sudden it was like $1 a gallon. And the signs didn't even have space for a third digit. So the people were like, the gas station owners were painting a 1. And not only that, there were shortages all of a sudden. And so people were standing in long lines and sitting in their cars in long lines, and there was a general panic. So what happened was the general American consciousness turned away from looking outward and became more concerned inward and became more worried about their pockets and their families. And this kind of had a cooling effect on the American psyche. So, and this continued in the 1980s. In fact, the 1980s was known as the me generation, whereas the 60s and 70s could be called the we generation. The 80s were known as the me generation. The Republicans were now in power. Reagan had this concept called trickle-down economics, which the poor people called trickle-upon or trickle-on economics. They were the ones being trickled on. But Reagan and Stockdale, who was his economic chief, tried to push this concept that if the rich got richer, then everybody got richer. Of course, we know now that that doesn't make any sense, and Stockdale a few years later confessed that this was just a bunch of hooey. But at the time, it was the general feeling was that everybody should focus on financial strength, and so there was a lot of growth of certain areas, the financial market.
Hello? Hello? That was nice.
What happened?
Hung up. Ruined the interview and then hung up.
What?
They ruined the interview and then...
You didn't hear anything?
No, they hung up.
All right. Well, you can go to a wide-angle shot now.
I'm trying to.
Why don't you just take the phone off the hook? I don't think it'll ring, will it? What, is it going to buzz? Okay.
Okay. Okay, we gotta start wrapping it up soon. Because it's already been 40 minutes and it's supposed to be like a 15-minute video.
Okay. Well, we can edit.
I know. Okay. Alright. I'm gonna close it up. Do you remember when the Berlin Wall fell?
Yeah. Is this the actual question? Is that how you're going to ask it?
Let's ask it.
Because we can hardly hear you. Why don't you say it more clearly?
Do you remember the day that the Berlin Wall fell? Shoot. Sorry. Do you remember the day that the Berlin Wall fell?
Well, it didn't fall in one day. But
okay, I don't want to seem stupid.
Yeah, I remember even more impactful to me. I remember the Tiananmen Square massacre.
Okay.
You were just 6 months old, and we had taken you to San Francisco.
Wait, because we're not gonna be able to edit that together. I have to ask you something because I'm like, do you remember the day? And then I seem stupid.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay,
should I
we can
ask
start
about
again.
What the Tiananmen?
Tiananmen Square massacre.
Where were you?
We were in San Francisco with you. Or you could group them together, you know, Berlin Wall or Chinese problems in China.
Did you witness or were you personally affected by the fall of the Berlin Wall?
Well, I remember being very moved by it, and you were just a few months old. I remember feeling very excited and wishing that I could be there for the celebrations. And I was also very nervous because I felt that the Soviet Union had shown before that it could be duplicitous and in one moment accede to liberalization, and in the next moment, as what happened in Czechoslovakia in '68, they would send the tanks in and crush the liberalization, crush the freedom movement, and kill hundreds of people. And I was very worried about that. And that's what happened in China, actually, in the Tiananmen Square massacre, that China allowed a certain amount of liberalization and freedom of speech, and the average citizen was allowed to vent their complaints to the media, and then a couple of days later, thousands and thousands of young people and old people and average middle-class people were in the square, Tiananmen Square, a very famous location, and they were confronted by tanks with shells, and hundreds were killed. Hundreds were run over or shot. We don't really know how many hundreds were killed. We have a lot of it on video, and we've seen some of it, but the Chinese still have refused to make any apologies for that.
We're out of battery.
Okay. Did it just die?
It's about to die.
Okay.
Thank you for your interview.
Don't you want to have a wrap-up? Like,
How should I do a wrap-up?
I don't know. Like, do you think you lived in exciting times? Or?
Do you think that you lived in exciting times?
Yes, I think that my generation has witnessed incredible changes, benefits, and things that we still have to work on solving.
Thank you.
And Dani is the most popular girl in class. Vote for her in '06.
Alright, sorry, Daddy.
What? Why are you sorry?
I feel like it wasn't a good interview.
It was fine, Dani. For your first interview, it was great.
Thank you. We get to watch the progress of Rosie throughout the...
Oh my God, she was behind me the whole time?
She hopped up about halfway through.
How am I going to edit that?
That'll be fine.
Do you have any cutaways?
Stop it and rewind and